20 years maximum security, no parole. Judge David Chambers's gavel cracked against the mahogany like a gunshot, his satisfaction barely concealed as he glared down at the black woman in the defendant's chair. The morning sunlight streaming through the courthouse's tall windows illuminated his smirk as he leaned forward. "People like you never learn, do you, Miss Bennett? 3 strikes, you're out. That's how justice works in my courtroom." He adjusted his black robes with theatrical authority, completely unaware that the quiet woman in the red blazer and black slacks sitting before him wasn't just another defendant. She was federal prosecutor Mia Bennett, and every word he'd just spoken was being recorded by a federal task force investigating judicial bias. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The bright fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the courtroom, but nothing was darker than the prejudice radiating from Judge David Chambers's bench. Mia Bennett sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral despite the shock rippling through the gallery behind her. 20 years. For charges that typically carried 5 to 7 years maximum. The numbers echoed in her mind, but her face betrayed nothing. "Your Honor," defense attorney Lisa Rodriguez stammered from beside her, half rising from her chair. "The sentence seems excessive given the circumstances of the case. Perhaps we could consider." Judge David Chambers cut her off with a wave of his hand, his eyes never leaving Mia Bennett's face. "Counselor Rodriguez, I've reviewed this defendant's history extensively. 3 prior convictions, a pattern of disregard for the law, and absolutely no remorse shown throughout these proceedings." He leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of absolute authority. "This court has been far too lenient with repeat offenders, particularly those who show such blatant disrespect for our justice system. 20 years maximum security is exactly what this case demands." From the third row of the gallery, Agent Tyler Brooks watched every gesture, every word, his trained eyes cataloging the obvious bias dripping from Judge David Chambers's voice. The federal investigator's muscular frame was tense beneath his navy suit and white dress shirt, his jaw clenched as he witnessed the systematic targeting they'd suspected for months. His earpiece crackled softly with updates from the surveillance team positioned throughout the courthouse. Court reporter Janet Thompson's fingers flew across her stenography machine, capturing every prejudiced syllable. Her eyes occasionally darted to Judge David Chambers's face, documenting the satisfaction that spread across his features as he delivered what he clearly believed was righteous punishment. She'd been recording similar scenes for months, building an ironclad case, word by word, keystroke by keystroke. "Ms. Bennett," Judge David Chambers continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone that made several gallery members shift uncomfortably. "You stand before this court as a perfect example of why our communities struggle with crime. 3 chances, 3 opportunities to change your path. And what did you do? You threw them all away." His finger jabbed the air toward her. "Well, the taxpayers won't be funding your poor decisions anymore. 20 years in maximum security will give you plenty of time to reflect on the consequences of your choices." Mia Bennett finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Her dark eyes held depths of intelligence and determination that Judge David Chambers completely missed. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I accept your decision." The simple dignity in her response seemed to irritate him further. Judge David Chambers's face reddened slightly as he shuffled through his paperwork. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Bennett. Maximum security isn't a vacation. You'll be processed through county holding today, then transferred to state facility within 48 hours. He glanced at the bailiff. "Make sure the defendant understands the terms of her sentence." Defense attorney Lisa Rodriguez gathered her papers with trembling hands, playing her role as the overwhelmed public defender to perfection. Every stumble, every moment of apparent incompetence was carefully calculated to reinforce Judge David Chambers's assumptions about the quality of legal representation minority defendants received in his courtroom. "Your Honor, we'll be filing an immediate appeal." "Save your breath, Counselor." Judge David Chambers interrupted dismissively. This sentence is ironclad. 20 years, no parole, case closed. He turned his attention back to Mia Bennett. Stand for sentencing finalization. Mia Bennett rose gracefully, her red blazer pristine despite hours in the defendant's chair. The bright courthouse lighting caught the subtle recording device hidden in her lapel pin, a tiny piece of technology that was capturing every moment of judicial misconduct. Her black slacks were perfectly pressed, her posture erect and dignified. She looked nothing like the broken repeat offender Judge David Chambers believed her to be. The bailiff, a heavy-set man in a short-sleeved uniform, approached with shackles. Judge David Chambers watched with obvious satisfaction as the metal cuffs clicked around Mia Bennett's wrists. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom like a death knell. Let this serve as a warning to anyone else who thinks they can repeatedly violate the law in my jurisdiction, Judge David Chambers announced to the gallery. Justice in this courtroom is swift and certain. Those who choose crime will face the full consequences of their actions. Agent Tyler Brooks felt his phone vibrate with an encrypted message from the surveillance team. The recording equipment had captured everything, every biased word, every prejudiced gesture. Every moment of the systematic targeting they'd suspected was now documented evidence in what would become the largest judicial corruption case in the district's history. As the bailiff prepared to escort Mia Bennett from the courtroom, she allowed herself one final look around the space where so many others had received similar unjust treatment. The bright natural light streaming through the tall windows seemed to promise that darkness couldn't last forever. Her mission was proceeding exactly as planned. The gallery began to empty, but Agent Tyler Brooks remained seated, watching Judge David Chambers organize his papers with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed he'd dispensed perfect justice. The federal investigator's expression was stone cold as he observed the judge's obvious pleasure at destroying what he assumed was another minority life. Court reporter Janet Thompson finished her transcription, her equipment having captured not just the words but the tone, the inflection, the unmistakable bias that permeated every aspect of the proceedings. She gathered her materials methodically, each page another nail in Judge David Chambers' coffin. Defense attorney Lisa Rodriguez packed her briefcase with apparent defeat, playing her role to the end. She avoided eye contact with Judge David Chambers, reinforcing his belief that he'd witnessed another example of inadequate legal representation for minority defendants. Your Honor, the bailiff said, approaching the bench, ready for transport to county holding. Judge David Chambers nodded approvingly. Make sure she's processed quickly. Maximum security doesn't wait for anyone. He glanced one final time at Mia Bennett, his satisfaction evident. 20 years, that's what real justice looks like. As Mia Bennett was led toward the courtroom doors, her chains clanking softly against the marble floor, she maintained her composure completely. The federal prosecutor inside her was already calculating the next phase of the operation. Every moment of bias, every prejudiced comment, every obvious pleasure Judge David Chambers took in destroying lives was now evidence in a federal investigation that would ultimately destroy his career. The courtroom doors closed behind them with a soft thud, leaving Judge David Chambers alone with his twisted sense of justice. He had no idea that the quiet woman in the red blazer and black slacks he just sentenced to 20 years maximum security was about to bring down his entire corrupt network. Agent Tyler Brooks finally stood, straightening his navy jacket as he prepared to leave. The morning's performance had been perfect. Judge David Chambers had taken the bait completely, revealing the systematic bias that had destroyed countless lives. The federal task force now had everything they needed to proceed with the next phase of their investigation. The bright courthouse, fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, illuminating the empty courtroom where justice had been perverted once again. But this time, someone was watching, someone was recording, and someone was about to ensure that Judge David Chambers finally faced the consequences of his actions. The sentence that started everything had been delivered. Now the real justice could begin. The bright overhead fluorescent lights in the FBI field office cast sharp shadows across the conference table as Agent Tyler Brooks spread dozens of case files across its surface. Each manila folder represented a life destroyed, a family torn apart, a future stolen. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating charts and graphs that told a story of systematic corruption so extensive it made Tyler's jaw clench with barely contained rage. "Take a look at these numbers," Tyler said, his muscular frame leaning over the evidence as Detective Natalie Sanders entered the room. She wore a crisp white button-down shirt and navy blue slacks, her expression grim as she carried another box of files. Judge David Chambers has been on the bench for 12 years. In that time, he's sentenced over 3,000 defendants. Natalie set down her box and moved closer to examine the data. The statistics were damning. White defendants appearing before Judge Chambers received an average sentence of 18 months for drug possession charges. Black defendants faced an average of 7 years for identical crimes. The pattern was so consistent, so deliberate, it could only be intentional. "Look at this case," Tyler continued, pulling out a thick file. Marcus Williams, 22 years old, first-time offender, caught with 2 grams of marijuana. Judge Chambers gave him 5 years in maximum security. Compare that to Brad Morrison, same age, same charge, but white, 6 months probation and community service. The fluorescent lighting overhead seemed to grow brighter as the scope of the injustice became clear. Natalie flipped through more files, her anger building with each page. "This isn't just bias, Tyler. This is a deliberate system designed to destroy lives." "It gets worse," Tyler replied, moving to a large whiteboard covered in photographs and connecting lines. "We've traced Judge Chambers' financial records. He has significant investments in Cornerstone Correctional Corporation, the private prison company that houses 60% of his sentenced defendants. The federal task force had been investigating Judge Chambers for 8 months, building an airtight case that would expose not just one corrupt judge, but an entire network of officials profiting from human misery. The bright natural light streaming through the windows provided perfect illumination as Tyler outlined their findings on the board. Detective Natalie Sanders opened her laptop and pulled up a financial analysis that made the corruption even more transparent. Over the past 5 years, Judge Chambers has received over $2 million in kickbacks disguised as consulting fees and speaking engagements. Every harsh sentence he delivers puts money directly into his pocket. The door opened, and Agent Tyler Brooks looked up as more members of their federal task force entered the brightly lit conference room. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez wore a dark blue blazer and gray slacks, carrying additional evidence boxes. Behind her, analyst David Kim pushed a cart loaded with computer equipment and surveillance recordings. "We've been monitoring Judge Chambers' communications," Maria announced, connecting her laptop to the large wall monitor. "He's been coordinating with Captain Gary Ellis from the Municipal Police Department. Ellis ensures that minority defendants are charged with enhanced penalties that mandate longer sentences." The wall monitor flickered to life, showing transcripts of recorded phone conversations. Under the bright overhead lighting, the words seemed to burn with malicious intent. Judge Chambers' voice came through the speakers, cold and calculating, as he discussed quotas and profit margins, as if he were running a business rather than dispensing justice. Tyler's expression hardened as he listened to the recordings. "This conversation is from 3 weeks ago. Judge Chambers is literally discussing how many more minorities he needs to sentence to meet his quarterly targets." The fluorescent lights cast sharp angles across the evidence as Natalie presented the most devastating part of their investigation. "We've identified 43 defendants who received excessive sentences based purely on their race. Mothers separated from children, fathers locked away for decades, all to pad Judge Chambers' bank account. One case file stood out among the rest. Tyler picked it up, his voice heavy with emotion as he read the details aloud. "Sarah Johnson, 35 years old, single mother of 3, caught writing a bad check for groceries when her welfare benefits were delayed. Judge Chambers sentenced her to 8 years in maximum security for fraud. Her children are now in foster care." The bright natural lighting streaming through the windows illuminated photographs of the victims, their faces staring out from the evidence board like a monument to injustice. Young men who should have been starting careers, mothers who should have been raising their children, elderly defendants who would likely die behind bars for minor infractions. The psychological evaluation we commissioned shows a clear pattern. Analyst David Kim reported, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the data on his tablet. Judge Chambers exhibits classic narcissistic personality traits, combined with deep-seated racial prejudice. He genuinely believes he's performing a public service by removing minorities from society. Agent Tyler Brooks moved to another section of the whiteboard, where surveillance photographs showed Judge Chambers meeting with various officials in restaurants and private clubs. The images, taken with high-resolution cameras under various lighting conditions, revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond one judge. Captain Gary Ellis meets with Judge Chambers every Thursday at the Riverside Country Club, Tyler explained, pointing to a series of photographs. They discuss upcoming cases and coordinate charging strategies to maximize sentences. Ellis wears his full uniform to these meetings, using his authority to intimidate anyone who might question their arrangement. Detective Natalie Sanders pulled up additional financial records on her laptop, the bright screen reflecting off the polished conference table. We've traced payments from Cornerstone Correctional Corporation through shell companies to accounts controlled by Judge Chambers, Captain Ellis, and at least 6 other officials. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Court clerks were paid to expedite certain cases while delaying others. Prosecutors received bonuses for securing enhanced charges against minority defendants. Even some defense attorneys were compromised, providing inadequate representation to ensure convictions. This is why Federal Prosecutor Mia Bennett volunteered for the undercover operation, Tyler said, his voice filled with admiration and concern. She grew up in this community. She's seen firsthand how this corruption destroys families and perpetuates cycles of poverty and incarceration. The bright overhead fluorescent lighting seemed to intensify as Tyler explained Mia's background. She had been the first person in her family to attend college, then law school, working her way up through the federal prosecutor's office by handling the most challenging cases with integrity and skill. When we identified Judge Chambers as our target, Mia insisted on going undercover. Tyler continued. She said she couldn't stand by while this corruption continued to destroy lives in her community. She volunteered to pose as a repeat offender, knowing the risks. The conference room fell silent as the full weight of Mia's sacrifice became clear. She had put her career, her freedom, and potentially her life on the line to expose this systematic injustice. Under the bright natural lighting streaming through the windows, her courage seemed to illuminate the entire investigation. Agent Maria Rodriguez opened another file containing surveillance footage from inside various courtrooms. We've been recording Judge Chambers' behavior for months. The pattern is consistent. He shows clear bias in his body language, tone of voice, and sentencing decisions when dealing with minority defendants. The wall monitor displayed courtroom footage, showing Judge Chambers' dramatically different demeanor when sentencing white versus black defendants. With white defendants, he was patient, considerate, often reducing recommended sentences. With minority defendants, he was cold, dismissive, frequently exceeding sentencing guidelines. The psychological impact on the community has been devastating. Detective Natalie Sanders reported, reviewing social services data. Families destroyed, children traumatized, entire neighborhoods destabilized by the removal of breadwinners and caregivers for minor offenses. Tyler moved to the final section of their evidence board, where photographs showed the human cost of Judge Chambers' corruption. Under the bright fluorescent lighting, the faces of victims seemed to demand justice. Elderly men serving decades for minor property crimes, young women locked away during their most productive years, teenagers tried as adults and sentenced to adult maximum security facilities. Tomorrow, Mia begins the next phase of our operation, Tyler announced, his voice filled with determination. She'll be processed through the county jail system, gathering intelligence from inside while maintaining her cover as a repeat offender. The federal task force understood the dangers Mia faced. If her true identity was discovered, corrupt officials might silence her permanently. But they also knew that traditional investigation methods had failed to penetrate this network of corruption. Judge Chambers has no idea that yesterday's sentencing was recorded by federal agents. Agent Maria Rodriguez said with satisfaction, every prejudiced word, every display of bias, every violation of constitutional rights has been documented and will be used against him. The bright natural light streaming through the conference room windows seemed to symbolize hope as the federal task force prepared for the next phase of their operation. They had spent months building an airtight case, but Mia's undercover work would provide the final evidence needed to destroy Judge Chambers and his corrupt network. As the meeting concluded, Tyler looked around the room at his dedicated team. Under the brilliant overhead fluorescent lighting, their faces showed determination, anger at the injustice they had uncovered, and hope that their work would finally bring accountability to a system that had failed so many innocent people. The files and evidence would remain under the bright lights of the FBI office, waiting for the moment when justice would finally be served. The fluorescent lights in the county jail processing center cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls. As Mia Bennett stood with her hands cuffed behind her back, the red blazer that had looked so professional in the courtroom now hung wrinkled and disheveled from her shoulders, while her black slacks bore creases from the uncomfortable ride in the transport van. She kept her expression carefully neutral, playing the role of a defeated defendant, while her prosecutor's mind cataloged every detail of the systematic abuse she was witnessing firsthand. Sheriff Dennis Cole strutted toward her with the swagger of a man drunk on petty power. His short-sleeved uniform was pressed to military precision, the badge on his chest gleaming under the overhead lights. His pale face carried the smug satisfaction of someone who enjoyed the authority his position granted him over those he considered beneath him. The way his eyes narrowed as he looked at Mia revealed the same prejudice she had seen in Judge Chambers's courtroom just hours earlier. Well, another one of Chambers's frequent flyers," Dennis sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. 20 years, huh? Guess you finally learned that actions have consequences." He grabbed Mia's arm with unnecessary force, his fingers digging into her skin through the fabric of her blazer. The roughness was deliberate, calculated to intimidate and demoralize. Mia forced herself to remain passive, though every instinct screamed at her to remind this corrupt officer exactly who she was and what authority she really held. The processing room buzzed with activity under the bright fluorescent lighting that left nowhere to hide. Other officers moved through their routines with mechanical efficiency, their faces showing the casual indifference of people who had grown numb to the human suffering they processed daily. Mia observed how differently they treated defendants based on appearance and color, noting the stark contrast between the respectful handling of white inmates and the aggressive treatment reserved for minorities. "Strip search. Cell block C," Dennis barked to a female officer, never bothering to look at Mia as a person. She was just another number to him, another body to be processed through a system designed to break spirits and destroy hope. The female officer, whose nameplate read Johnson, approached with slightly more professionalism than Dennis, though Mia could see the weariness in her eyes that came from years of participating in institutional cruelty. As she was led through the maze of corridors toward the holding cells, Mia's trained legal mind cataloged every procedural violation, every instance of excessive force, every sign of systematic abuse. The concrete floors were polished to a dull shine under the relentless overhead lighting, and the walls bore the scuff marks and scratches of thousands of inmates who had passed through these same halls. The smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of fear, desperation, and human suffering that permeated the facility. The holding cell door clanged shut behind her, with a finality that would have been terrifying if she didn't know it was temporary. The cell was a rectangle of concrete and steel, illuminated by more harsh fluorescent lights that made every surface appear cold and unforgiving. 3 other women occupied the space, each telling a story of systematic injustice through their posture and expressions. In the corner sat Maria Santos, a young woman barely out of her teens, whose dark eyes held the hollow look of someone whose spirit had been systematically crushed. She wore a faded orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her thin frame, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hopelessness that came from knowing the system was rigged against her from the start. 5 years for shoplifting, Maria whispered when Mia carefully asked about her situation. It was baby formula for my daughter. Chambers said I was a repeat offender, but my previous conviction was just a traffic ticket. That prosecutor, Thomas Gray, he pushed for the maximum sentence like I had robbed a bank. Her words hit Mia like physical blows, each detail adding to the mountain of evidence she was building against the corrupt network. Across from Maria sat Angela Washington, a middle-aged woman whose orange top and blue jacket marked her as another victim of Judge Chambers's systematic bias. Her case was even more egregious than Maria's. 8 years for writing bad checks, Angela explained, her voice carrying controlled anger. I was trying to keep my lights on after my husband lost his job. Thomas Gray told the court I was running a fraud operation. Never mind that the total amount was less than $300, or that I tried to make it right as soon as I could. The third woman, Carmen Rodriguez, wore the same orange and blue combination that seemed to be the uniform of the unjustly convicted. Her story was the most heartbreaking of all. 15 years for drug possession, she said quietly, staring at the concrete floor. It wasn't even mine. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Gray convinced the jury I was a dealer. Chambers smiled when he gave me the sentence. Actually smiled, like he was enjoying ruining my life. As Mia listened to each woman's story, the pattern became undeniably clear. Thomas Gray, the prosecutor who worked hand in hand with Judge Chambers, consistently pushed for maximum sentences, regardless of circumstances, prior history, or the nature of the crime. The systematic targeting of minority defendants wasn't just bias, it was a coordinated effort designed to feed bodies into a system that profited from human misery. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mia carefully committed every detail to memory. She couldn't take notes, obviously, but her prosecutor's training allowed her to organize and catalog information with precision. Each story represented not just individual tragedy, but evidence of federal crimes that would bring down the entire corrupt network. What about appeals? Mia asked carefully, maintaining her cover as another desperate defendant looking for hope. The question prompted bitter laughter from all three women. Appeals? Maria scoffed. With what money? And even if you could afford a lawyer, who's going to go against Chambers in this county? Everyone knows he controls the system. The public defenders are overworked and underfunded, and the private attorneys who might actually fight for you won't take cases they know they'll lose. Angela nodded grimly. The whole system is designed to keep us here. Chambers gets his convictions. Gray builds his reputation as a tough prosecutor, and we disappear into the prison system, where nobody has to think about us anymore. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor. Through the bars of the cell, Mia could see Sheriff Dennis Cole approaching with another inmate, his treatment equally rough and dismissive. The new arrival was a young black woman whose crime, Mia would later learn, was driving with a suspended license. Thomas Gray had somehow convinced Judge Chambers that this warranted 6 months in county lockup. As evening approached, and the fluorescent lights remained as harsh and unforgiving as ever, Mia found herself calculating the human cost of the corruption she was investigating. Each woman in this cell represented dozens more throughout the system, all victims of a coordinated effort to abuse the justice system for personal gain. The sound of her name being called broke through her thoughts. Bennett. Legal visit. The officer's voice echoed off the concrete walls, and Mia felt a surge of relief. Agent Brooks was maintaining contact as promised, using the cover of legal counsel to check on her progress and ensure her safety. As she was led through the corridors toward the visitor area, Mia caught glimpses of other holding cells, each filled with similar stories of systematic injustice. The bright overhead lighting illuminated faces marked by despair, anger, and the kind of hopelessness that came from being trapped in a system designed to destroy rather than rehabilitate. The visitor area was another sterile room, dominated by fluorescent lighting and monitored conversations. Agent Brooks sat behind the reinforced glass partition, playing his role as her attorney with convincing professionalism. His suit and briefcase completed the illusion, while his eyes communicated the urgency and importance of the intelligence she was gathering. Through carefully coded language that would sound like routine legal discussion to any monitoring guards, Mia conveyed the systematic nature of the abuse she was witnessing. Every story from her cellmates, every instance of excessive force from Sheriff Cole, every detail about Thomas Gray's role in the conspiracy was transmitted through words that sounded mundane but carried explosive implications for the federal investigation. Your case has several viable grounds for appeal, Agent Brooks said for the benefit of any listening ears. while his expression confirmed that the evidence she was providing was exactly what the federal team needed to build their case. As Mia was escorted back to her cell, she carried with her the weight of responsibility that came with being the only hope these women had for justice. Her red blazer, now more wrinkled than ever, felt like a badge of honor rather than a symbol of defeat. She was exactly where she needed to be, gathering the evidence that would finally expose the corrupt network that had destroyed so many innocent lives. The cell door clanged shut once again, but this time the sound carried different meaning. It wasn't the closing of a trap. It was the final piece falling into place in a carefully orchestrated plan that would soon deliver justice to those who had abused their power for far too long. Under the harsh fluorescent lights that had witnessed so much suffering, Mia Bennett prepared for the next phase of her mission, knowing that every moment of injustice she endured was bringing them closer to the explosive revelation that would change everything. The federal building's conference room buzzed with intense energy as fluorescent lights cast stark illumination over walls covered in evidence. Agent Tyler Brooks stood before a massive whiteboard displaying photographs, financial documents, and connection lines that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it defied belief. His muscular frame was outlined against the bright overhead lighting as he addressed the assembled federal task force. "What we've uncovered goes far beyond one biased judge," Agent Tyler Brooks announced, his voice carrying the weight of devastating revelation. "We're looking at a systematic operation designed to funnel minority defendants into private prisons for profit." Detective Natalie Sanders, wearing a navy blazer and gray slacks, stepped forward with a thick folder of documents. The natural skylight, streaming through the conference room windows, highlighted the grim determination on her face. "The financial records don't lie. Judge David Chambers has received over $2 million in kickbacks from Sentinel Correctional Corporation over the past 5 years. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and civil rights investigators absorbed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just judicial bias. This was a criminal enterprise masquerading as justice. Agent Tyler Brooks pointed to a series of bank statements displayed on the projection screen. These offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are directly linked to Judge David Chambers. Every deposit corresponds with periods of increased sentencing rates for minority defendants in his courtroom. Detective Natalie Sanders opened another file, revealing transaction records that painted an even darker picture. Captain Gary Ellis has been coordinating arrests specifically to feed Judge David Chambers' courtroom. They've been targeting minority communities with aggressive policing tactics, ensuring a steady supply of defendants for their scheme. Federal Prosecutor Sarah Chen, wearing a black suit and white blouse, shook her head in disgust. "The statistical analysis is damning. White defendants in Judge David Chambers' courtroom receive sentences averaging 60% lighter than minorities for identical crimes. This isn't unconscious bias. This is deliberate discrimination for financial gain." Agent Tyler Brooks moved to another section of the evidence board, where photographs of key conspirators were displayed. Prosecutor Thomas Gray has been pushing for maximum sentences, regardless of circumstances or evidence. His conviction rate for minorities is 97%, compared to 43% for white defendants. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Detective Natalie Sanders revealed another shocking connection. Gray's law firm receives substantial consulting fees from the same private prison corporation paying Judge David Chambers. They've created a pipeline from arrest to incarceration, with profits at every step. Federal agent Maria Gonzalez, reviewing intercepted communications, looked up from her laptop with barely controlled anger. The recorded phone calls between Judge David Chambers and Sentinel correctional executives are explicit. They discuss quotas, payment schedules, and which types of cases to prioritize. Agent Tyler Brooks clicked to the next slide, showing architectural plans and guard rotations. This is where it gets even worse. Warden Christopher Webb at Riverside Correctional has been implementing punitive measures specifically targeting inmates sentenced by Judge David Chambers. Extended solitary confinement, restricted family visits, denial of educational programs. He's ensuring these victims suffer maximum punishment. The natural skylight cast long shadows across the conference table as Detective Natalie Sanders revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Webb receives performance bonuses based on recidivism rates. By making conditions deliberately harsh and denying rehabilitation programs, he increases the likelihood that released inmates will reoffend and return to the system. Federal civil rights attorney David Park stood up, his tall frame illuminated by the bright overhead lighting. The constitutional violations are staggering. Due process, equal protection, cruel and unusual punishment. These defendants never had a chance at fair treatment. Agent Tyler Brooks pointed to a timeline showing the escalation of the scheme. It started small 5 years ago, but they've grown increasingly bold. Judge David Chambers was sentencing first-time marijuana possession to 15 years, while similar white defendants received probation. Detective Natalie Sanders revealed intercepted text messages between the conspirators. They have code names for different sentence lengths. Full package means maximum security for 20 years. Standard service means 10 to 15 years. They're literally shopping human lives. The conference room fell into stunned silence as the investigators processed the systematic nature of the corruption. These weren't isolated incidents of bias. This was an organized criminal operation that had destroyed hundreds of lives for profit. Federal agent Jennifer Walsh, wearing a gray suit and blue blouse, presented psychological profiles of the conspirators. The personality assessments show classic traits of individuals who dehumanize their victims. They genuinely don't see minority defendants as deserving equal treatment. Agent Tyler Brooks received a secured message on his phone and looked up with grim satisfaction. Prosecutor Mia Bennett has just transmitted new evidence from inside the system. Judge David Chambers and Captain Gary Ellis met yesterday to discuss eliminating witnesses who might testify about their practices. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Detective Natalie Sanders revealed the most shocking evidence yet. They've been systematically intimidating defense attorneys who challenged their sentences. 3 public defenders have been threatened, and 1 was actually assaulted after appealing one of Judge David Chambers' excessive sentences. Federal Prosecutor Chen reviewed the evidence tampering documentation that Mia Bennett had uncovered during her undercover operation. Police reports have been altered, witness statements fabricated, and exculpatory evidence deliberately withheld. The scope of misconduct spans the entire judicial process. Agent Tyler Brooks moved to a map showing the geographic spread of the conspiracy. This network extends beyond our jurisdiction. We've identified similar patterns in 3 neighboring districts, all connected to the same private prison corporation. The natural skylight streaming through the conference room windows created an almost ethereal atmosphere as the investigators realized they had uncovered one of the most extensive judicial corruption schemes in modern history. Detective Natalie Sanders presented financial projections showing the conspirators had generated over $50 million in private prison revenue through their systematic targeting of minority communities. Federal Agent Gonzalez looked up from her communications equipment with urgent news. Prosecutor Mia Bennett reports that Warden Christopher Webb is planning to transfer several key witnesses to maximum security facilities in other states. He's trying to isolate potential testimony before our operation concludes. Agent Tyler Brooks felt the weight of responsibility as he surveyed the mountain of evidence surrounding them. We have 48 hours before Mia Bennett's cover becomes unsustainable. Judge David Chambers is already suspicious about the federal presence around the courthouse. Detective Natalie Sanders coordinated with the arrest teams positioned throughout the city. Captain Gary Ellis has increased security around himself and Judge David Chambers. They know something is wrong, but they don't know how deep we've penetrated their operation. The bright fluorescent lighting cast sharp shadows as Agent Tyler Brooks outlined the final phase of their investigation. When we move, it has to be simultaneous and comprehensive. Judge David Chambers, Captain Gary Ellis, Prosecutor Thomas Gray, and Warden Christopher Webb all need to be arrested before they can communicate with each other. Federal Civil Rights Attorney Park reviewed the victim impact statements that would be presented during prosecution. As the conference concluded, Agent Tyler Brooks felt the morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting sharp rectangles of golden light across the polished marble floor. Federal Prosecutor Mia Bennett sat in the defendant's holding area, her red blazer now wrinkled from days of wear, black slacks creased from sleeping on a thin jail mattress. But her eyes remained sharp, focused, calculating. Today was the day everything would change. Sheriff Dennis Cole unlocked her handcuffs with unnecessary force. His short-sleeved uniform stretched tight across his bulky frame. His satisfaction was evident as he roughly guided her toward the courtroom entrance. "Time for your little appeal hearing, Bennett," he sneered, using the fake surname she'd adopted for this operation. "Judge Chambers is gonna love crushing your hopes again." Mia maintained her defeated posture, shoulders slumped, head down, but internally, every nerve was electric with anticipation. The trap they'd spent months setting was about to spring. The courtroom doors opened, revealing the familiar space where Judge David Chambers had dispensed his twisted version of justice for years. Natural light flooded through the massive windows, illuminating every corner with brilliant clarity. The overhead fluorescent fixtures hummed softly, ensuring no shadow could hide what was about to unfold. Agent Tyler Brooks sat in the third row, dressed in a simple gray suit and white dress shirt. His muscular frame remained relaxed, but his eyes tracked every movement in the room. Federal agents, disguised as court staff and observers, had positioned themselves strategically throughout the space. The net was closing. Defense attorney Lisa Rodriguez stood at the defendant's table, organizing papers with practiced efficiency. Her navy blue blazer and matching skirt projected professional competence. But there was something different about her demeanor today. Gone was the overwhelmed, unprepared attorney from the original sentencing. This Lisa Rodriguez moved with purpose and confidence. Court reporter Janet Thompson adjusted her equipment with meticulous care, her fingers poised over the keys. Every word spoken today would be preserved for posterity, documented with the precision that federal prosecutors demanded. She caught Mia's eye for just a fraction of a second, the smallest nod confirming everything was ready. Judge David Chambers swept into the courtroom with his usual arrogance, black robes billowing behind him. His gray hair was perfectly styled, his pale complexion radiating the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He settled into his elevated chair like a king ascending his throne. "All rise for the Honorable Judge David Chambers," the bailiff announced. The courtroom stood as one, but the atmosphere crackled with tension that Judge Chambers seemed oblivious to. He surveyed his domain with satisfaction, preparing to once again demonstrate his absolute power over the lives of those who appeared before him. "Be seated," Judge Chambers commanded, his voice echoing through the bright space. "We're here today for the appeal hearing in the matter of the state versus Sarah Bennett." Michael took her place beside Lisa Rodriguez, maintaining the dejected posture she'd perfected. But her mind was razor-sharp, cataloging every detail, every micro-expression that crossed Judge Chambers's face. "Your Honor," Lisa Rodriguez began, rising smoothly to her feet. "I'd like to present new evidence that I believe will demonstrate significant irregularities in my client's original sentencing." Judge Chambers leaned back in his chair, a condescending smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Rodriguez, I hardly think there's anything you could present that would change the facts of this case. Your client is a repeat offender who deserves exactly what she received." The natural light streaming through the windows seemed to intensify, as if the universe itself was preparing to illuminate the truth. Agent Tyler Brooks shifted slightly in his seat, his hand moving imperceptibly toward the communications device hidden in his jacket. "Nevertheless, Your Honor, I believe you'll find this evidence quite compelling," Lisa Rodriguez continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'd like to begin by presenting statistical analysis of sentencing patterns in this courtroom over the past 5 years. A flicker of something crossed Judge Chambers's face. Confusion? Concern. He straightened slightly in his chair. "I fail to see how statistics are relevant to this individual case, Counselor." But Lisa Rodriguez was already moving, approaching the evidence table with documents that seemed far too comprehensive for a simple appeal. The papers were organized with federal precision, bound in the kind of folders that suggested extensive investigation. "Your Honor, these statistics show a disturbing pattern." African American defendants in your courtroom receive sentences that average 47% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. Hispanic defendants receive sentences 39% longer. The disparity is mathematically impossible to attribute to chance. Judge Chambers's confident demeanor began to crack. His pale hands gripped the edge of his bench, knuckles whitening. This is highly irregular, Miss Rodriguez. These statistics have no bearing on your client's specific case. Mia watched the judge's growing discomfort with carefully concealed satisfaction. Every word was being recorded, every reaction documented. The noose was tightening with each passing moment. But that's not all, Your Honor. Lisa Rodriguez pressed forward relentlessly. I also have documentation showing unusual patterns in case assignments, particularly involving defendants of color. Cases seem to be steered specifically to your courtroom through irregular administrative channels. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft clicking of Janet Thompson's fingers on her recording equipment. Agent Tyler Brooks remained motionless, but his trained eyes caught every detail of Judge Chambers's increasingly nervous behavior. Where did you get this information? Judge Chambers demanded, his voice rising slightly. These are confidential administrative records. Lisa Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't the desperate smile of an overworked public defender. This smile held the confidence of someone backed by the full weight of federal authority. Your Honor, I've also uncovered financial records that show unusual deposits into accounts linked to your name. These deposits coincide remarkably with increases in the local prison population, particularly among minority defendants. Judge Chambers shot to his feet, his face flushing red above his black robes. This is outrageous. I demand to know where you obtained this information. This entire proceeding is out of order. The natural light seemed to spotlight his agitation, the bright courtroom offering no shadows to hide behind. Several supposed observers shifted in their seats, hands moving to concealed positions. Agent Tyler Brooks's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mia felt her heart racing, but kept her expression neutral. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Judge Chambers was walking directly into the trap they'd laid. Your Honor, Lisa Rodriguez continued calmly, I believe the court should also be aware that my client's original arrest report contains several inconsistencies. The arresting officer's statements don't align with the physical evidence, and there are gaps in the chain of custody that suggest possible tampering. Enough. Judge Chambers slammed his gavel with excessive force. I will not allow this courtroom to be turned into a circus by wild accusations and conspiracy theories. But his protest only served to highlight his desperation. A truly innocent judge would welcome investigation, would demand transparency. Judge Chambers's violent reaction spoke volumes about his guilt. Janet Thompson's fingers never stopped moving, capturing every word of the judge's increasingly erratic behavior. The official record was building, creating an unbreakable chain of documented corruption. Furthermore, Lisa Rodriguez pressed on, her voice growing stronger. I have evidence that suggests coordination between this court, certain police officials, and private prison corporations. The pattern suggests a systematic effort to increase incarceration rates for financial gain. Judge Chambers's face went white, then red, then white again. His breathing became labored, and sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the comfortable temperature in the bright courtroom. You're making very serious accusations, Counselor, he said, his voice now carrying a threatening edge. I hope you're prepared to face the consequences of slandering a sitting judge. But the threat fell flat in the face of Lisa Rodriguez's unwavering confidence. She moved to her table and retrieved another folder, this one marked with official federal seals. Your Honor, I also have documentation showing unusual communication patterns between your chambers and certain law enforcement officials. Phone records, email exchanges, meeting schedules that suggest coordination beyond normal judicial procedures. The tension in the courtroom was becoming unbearable. Agent Tyler Brooks could see Judge Chambers beginning to panic, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Other federal agents remained motionless, but ready to move at a moment's notice. Michael watched Judge Chambers' growing desperation with a mixture of satisfaction and professional fascination. This was how corruption died, exposed under the bright lights of justice, unable to hide in the shadows any longer. Your Honor, Lisa Rodriguez continued relentlessly, the evidence suggests that my client, like many others, was targeted not because of any real criminal activity, but because she fit a demographic profile that would ensure maximum sentencing and maximum profit for your associates. Judge Chambers was now visibly shaking, his arrogance replaced by barely contained terror. He looked around the courtroom as if seeing it clearly for the first time, noticing the unfamiliar faces, the too attentive observers, the federal precision of the evidence being presented. "This is impossible," he whispered, then louder, "This is a setup. This whole thing is a setup." The words hung in the air like a confession. Agent Tyler Brooks felt a surge of satisfaction as Judge Chambers essentially admitted to having something to hide. An innocent man wouldn't assume he was being set up unless he knew there was something to find. Lisa Rodriguez moved closer to the bench, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew she held all the cards. "Your Honor, the evidence shows a pattern of corruption so systematic, so deliberate, that it represents one of the most serious breaches of judicial ethics in recent history." Judge Chambers gripped the edge of his bench, so hard his knuckles went white. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he hissed. "There are powerful people involved in this, people who won't tolerate interference." Another admission, another nail in his coffin. Janet Thompson's fingers flew across her equipment, ensuring every incriminating word was preserved. Mia felt the moment approaching like an electrical storm, the air itself charged with anticipation. Soon, very soon, she would reveal her true identity and bring this corrupt system crashing down. "Your Honor," Lisa Rodriguez said, her voice now carrying the full weight of federal authority, "I believe the court should know that this investigation has been ongoing for months. Every transaction, every decision, every corrupt act has been documented with federal precision." Judge Chambers stumbled backward, his face ashen. "Federal? You're saying the federal government is involved in this circus?" The bright natural light streaming through the windows seemed to intensify, illuminating every corner of the courtroom with brilliant clarity. There would be no hiding, no shadows to retreat into. "Your Honor," Lisa Rodriguez announced, her voice clear and strong, "I believe it's time for the truth to be revealed. The defendant you sentenced to 20 years maximum security is not who you think she is." Judge Chambers's eyes darted to Mia, seeing her clearly for what felt like the first time. Something in her posture, something in the intelligence behind her eyes, made him take a step back. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. Mia slowly raised her head, her defeated posture melting away like a discarded disguise. When she looked at Judge Chambers, it was no longer with the broken spirit of a convicted criminal, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a federal prosecutor who had just gathered enough evidence to destroy him. The transformation was startling. Gone was the dejected defendant, replaced by a woman of obvious intelligence and authority. Her red blazer, wrinkled though it was, suddenly looked less like prison clothes and more like the professional attire of someone accustomed to wielding power. Judge Chambers staggered backward, the full magnitude of his situation beginning to dawn on him. "No," he whispered, "this isn't possible." But it was not only possible, it was happening. The trap had been set, the evidence gathered, and now the moment of revelation was at hand. Justice, so long delayed, was finally ready to strike. Agent Tyler Brooks felt his pulse quicken as he prepared to move. Federal agents throughout the courtroom tensed, ready for the signal. Court reporter Janet Thompson's fingers poised over her equipment, ready to document the most important words she would ever record. The bright courtroom, flooded with natural light and humming with fluorescent clarity, was about to witness the end of Judge David Chambers's reign of corruption, and Mia Bennett, federal prosecutor extraordinaire, was about to reveal the true power of justice when it finally, inevitably, came calling. The moment of truth had arrived. The courthouse buzzer echoed through the marble hallways as Mia Bennett was escorted back into Judge David Chambers's courtroom for what everyone believed would be a routine appeal hearing. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated every corner of the packed courtroom, casting sharp shadows across the wooden benches filled with spectators, reporters, and what appeared to be regular courthouse observers. Natural light streamed through the tall windows, creating an almost ethereal glow that would soon witness one of the most explosive revelations in the county's legal history. Judge David Chambers sat confidently behind his elevated bench, his black robes draped around his shoulders like a shield of authority. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his pale face wearing that familiar expression of smug superiority that had crushed so many dreams and destroyed countless lives over his corrupt career. He shuffled through papers with casual indifference, already prepared to deny whatever desperate plea this repeat offender might present through her overwhelmed public defender. Mia Bennett entered the courtroom in shackles, her red blazer, now wrinkled but still vibrant, paired with black slacks that had somehow maintained their professional appearance despite her time in the county jail system. Her dark skin seemed to glow under the bright courthouse lighting, and her eyes held a confidence that should have been impossible for someone facing 20 years in maximum security prison. She walked with her head held high, each step measured and purposeful, like a prosecutor approaching the bench rather than a defendant approaching judgment. Defense attorney Lisa Rodriguez stood at the defendant's table, her navy blue suit and white blouse crisp and professional. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with an unexpected authority that contrasted sharply with her previous overwhelmed demeanor. She organized her files with precision, each document placed exactly where it needed to be for what was about to unfold. Court reporter Janet Thompson sat at her station, fingers poised over her stenotype machine, ready to capture every word of what would become the most important transcript of her career. Her brown hair caught the fluorescent lighting as she adjusted her position, ensuring she had the perfect angle to document everything that was about to happen. Agent Tyler Brooks sat in the gallery's third row, his muscular frame filling out a dark gray suit and white dress shirt. His short black hair was neatly styled, and his sharp eyes surveyed the courtroom like a predator watching his prey. Several other individuals scattered throughout the gallery looked like ordinary citizens, but their alert postures and strategic positioning revealed their true identities as federal agents preparing for coordinated action. Judge David Chambers banged his gavel twice, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. Court is now in session for the appeal hearing of defendant. He glanced at his papers with practiced boredom. Mia Johnson. Lisa Rodriguez stood immediately, her voice carrying unexpected strength. Your Honor, before we proceed with this appeal, I need to present new evidence that has come to light regarding this case and several others that have appeared before this court. Judge David Chambers' pale eyebrows furrowed slightly, the first hint of annoyance crossing his features. Counselor, this is an appeal hearing, not a discovery session. Present your arguments for why this court should reconsider the defendant's well-deserved sentence, or will move directly to denial. Your Honor, Lisa Rodriguez continued, her voice growing stronger. The evidence I'm about to present directly relates to judicial misconduct, prosecutorial corruption, and systematic civil rights violations that have occurred in this very courtroom. The words hung in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Judge David Chambers' confident expression faltered for just a moment, his pale face showing the first flicker of uncertainty. Counselor, you are way out of line. This court will not tolerate baseless accusations against— They're not baseless, Your Honor. Mia Bennett's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, strong and clear and filled with authority that made several spectators sit up straighter in their seats. Judge David Chambers' face flushed red with anger. The defendant will remain silent or be held in contempt of court. Bailiff, if she speaks again. Actually, Your Honor. Mia Bennett stood gracefully, despite her shackles, her red blazer catching the light. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. My name is not Mia Johnson. My name is Mia Bennett, and I am a federal prosecutor with the United States Attorney's Office. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Judge David Chambers' face drained of all color, his pale complexion becoming almost ghostly under the bright fluorescent lighting. His hands gripped the edge of his bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. That's impossible, Judge David Chambers stammered, his usual authoritative voice cracking. You're a repeat offender. You have a criminal history. I've seen your file. Agent Tyler Brooks rose from his seat, his muscular frame commanding immediate attention as he displayed his federal credentials. Judge Chambers, I'm Agent Tyler Brooks, FBI. The woman you sentenced to 20 years maximum security is indeed Federal Prosecutor Mia Bennett. The criminal history you reviewed was fabricated as part of a federal investigation into corruption within this courthouse. Judge David Chambers' world began crumbling around him as federal agents positioned throughout the courtroom revealed themselves simultaneously. Men and women in dark suits stood up from various seats, their badges glinting under the bright lights, creating a coordinated display of federal authority that left no doubt about the seriousness of what was unfolding. Every word you've spoken in this courtroom has been recorded, Mia Bennett continued, her voice carrying the prosecutorial authority she'd been forced to hide for weeks. Every biased decision, every excessive sentence based on race, every corrupt ruling that filled your private prison investments with human beings whose only crime was being born with the wrong skin color. Lisa Rodriguez stepped forward, no longer playing the role of overwhelmed public defender. Your Honor, I am also a federal prosecutor working undercover as part of this operation. The evidence we've gathered includes financial records, recorded conversations, documented patterns of racial bias in sentencing, and proof of kickback schemes involving private prison corporations. Judge David Chambers tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, forcing him to grip his bench for support. This is entrapment. This is illegal. You can't. Actually, we can. Agent Tyler Brooks interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Federal prosecutors and FBI agents conducting undercover operations to expose judicial corruption is not only legal, it's necessary when the justice system itself has been corrupted. The courtroom doors burst open simultaneously as more federal agents flooded in, their coordinated entry designed to prevent any escape attempts. Detective Natalie Sanders, wearing a dark pantsuit and white blouse, led a team through the main entrance while other agents secured the side exits and back corridors. Prosecutor Thomas Gray, who had been sitting in the gallery, observing what he thought would be a routine appeal denial, suddenly realized the magnitude of his exposure. His pale face went ashen as he attempted to quietly slip toward a side exit, but Agent Tyler Brooks pointed directly at him. Thomas Gray, you're under arrest for conspiracy, prosecutorial misconduct, and civil rights violations. Two federal agents immediately flanked the corrupt prosecutor, their handcuffs already prepared. Captain Gary Ellis, who had entered the courtroom, expecting to coordinate with Judge David Chambers on upcoming cases, found himself surrounded by 3 federal agents before he could reach the door. His police uniform, with its short sleeves and polished badge, provided no protection against federal charges as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. This is insane. Judge David Chambers finally found his voice, though it cracked with panic. You people have no authority in my courtroom. I am a sitting judge with full judicial immunity. Mia Bennett smiled for the first time since entering the courthouse weeks ago, her dark face radiant with the satisfaction of justice finally being served. Judicial immunity doesn't protect you from criminal prosecution for corruption, Your Honor, and this stopped being your courtroom the moment you used it to systematically violate the civil rights of minority defendants for personal profit. Sheriff Dennis Cole, who had treated Mia Bennett with such contempt during her processing, burst through the courtroom's back entrance in full panic mode. His short-sleeved uniform was disheveled, sweat staining his shirt as he realized the federal trap that had been sprung. He spotted Detective Natalie Sanders and made a desperate dash toward what he thought was a friendly face. Detective Sanders, thank God you're here. These federal agents are trying to arrest everyone. Judge Chambers needs protection from this illegal operation. Detective Natalie Sanders smiled as she displayed her own federal credentials. Actually, Sheriff Cole, I'm also working undercover for this federal investigation, and you're under arrest for conspiracy and civil rights violations. The sheriff's face went through a range of emotions as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Shock, betrayal, anger, and finally resignation as he realized how thoroughly the federal government had infiltrated and exposed their corrupt network. Court reporter Janet Thompson continued transcribing every word, her fingers flying across the stenotype machine as she documented the complete collapse of the corrupt judicial network. Her brown hair fell across her face as she concentrated on capturing each confession, each admission, each piece of evidence that would be used in the federal prosecutions to come. Judge David Chambers slumped in his chair, the weight of his exposure crushing his arrogance like paper beneath a sledgehammer. "How long?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How long have you been watching?" Agent Tyler Brooks stepped closer to the bench, his muscular frame and professional demeanor representing the full power of federal justice. "Long enough to document everything, Judge Chambers. Every racially biased sentence, every kickback payment, every civil rights violation. We have financial records showing payments from private prison corporations to your offshore accounts. We have recordings of your conversations with co-conspirators. We have statistical evidence of your systematic targeting of minority defendants." Mia Bennett moved toward the judge's bench, her red blazer and black slacks, a stark contrast to the black robes that had represented such corruption. "Do you want to know what convinced me to volunteer for this undercover assignment, Judge Chambers? It was reading about Marcus Williams, a 19-year-old black student you sentenced to 15 years for possession of marijuana, while giving a white defendant with the same charge probation in the same week. It was learning about Patricia Johnson, a single black mother you sentenced to 10 years for writing bad checks totaling $200, while a white businessman who embezzled $50,000 got community service." The judge's pale face crumpled as the human cost of his corruption was laid bare before the packed courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashed, and the bright fluorescent lighting seemed to expose every shadow where corruption had been hiding. "Those people had families," Mia Bennett continued, her prosecutorial voice filling every corner of the courtroom. "They had children, dreams, futures that you destroyed for money. You turned justice into a commodity and sold it to the highest bidder, while wrapping yourself in the robes of respectability." Agent Tyler Brooks nodded to his team as the arrests continued in coordinated precision. "Judge David Chambers, you are under arrest for judicial corruption, conspiracy to violate civil rights, money laundering, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around Judge David Chambers' wrists, the irony was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The man who had sentenced countless defendants, who had looked down from his elevated bench with such superiority and contempt, now faced the same system of justice he had corrupted. The bright courthouse lighting that had witnessed so much injustice now illuminated the moment when justice finally prevailed. Federal agents led the corrupt officials out of the courtroom in handcuffs, while Mia Bennett stood tall in her red blazer, representing everything the justice system was supposed to be: fair, impartial, and dedicated to protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or economic status. As Judge David Chambers was escorted past her, Mia Bennett spoke one final time. 20 years maximum security. That's what you sentenced me to for being a black woman you thought you could abuse with impunity. Now let's see how the federal prison system treats a corrupt judge who spent his career destroying lives for profit." The courthouse erupted in applause as justice was finally served, and the bright lights continued to shine on a system that had been cleansed of its corruption through courage, dedication, and the unwavering pursuit of true justice. The bright fluorescent lights of Judge David Chambers' courtroom had witnessed countless acts of corruption, but nothing could have prepared them for this moment. Federal agents swarmed through the heavy oak doors, their tactical gear gleaming under the unforgiving overhead illumination. Agent Tyler Brooks, wearing a crisp navy suit and white dress shirt, stepped forward with handcuffs gleaming in his muscular hands. The same courtroom that had been Judge David Chambers' kingdom of bias was about to become his downfall. Judge David Chambers sat frozen behind his bench, his black robes suddenly feeling like a costume rather than a symbol of authority. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a ghost of his former arrogant self. The gavel that had once pronounced harsh sentences on innocent minorities now lay useless beside his trembling hands. "Judge David Chambers," Agent Tyler Brooks's voice echoed through the silent courtroom, each word carrying the weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for judicial corruption, conspiracy to violate civil rights, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The charges hung in the air like thunder, reverberating off the walls that had heard so many unjust verdicts. Mia Bennett stood in the witness box, still wearing her red blazer and black slacks. But now her true authority radiated from every fiber of her being. No longer the defeated defendant Judge David Chambers thought he was sentencing. She embodied the power of justice itself. Her eyes locked with his, and in that moment, he understood that every prejudiced word, every biased decision, every corrupt act had led to this inevitable reckoning. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Tyler Brooks continued, approaching the bench with measured steps. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The irony was not lost on anyone present. The man who had manipulated the law for personal gain was now subject to its full force. Judge David Chambers finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This is impossible. I'm a judge. You can't just arrest me in my own courtroom." Agent Tyler Brooks reached the bench, his muscular frame towering over the now powerless figure. "Your honor died with your corruption, Chambers. You're just a defendant now." The handcuffs clicked with finality as they secured around Judge David Chambers' wrists, the same hands that had signed countless unjust sentences. The courtroom erupted as reporters, who had been strategically positioned, began documenting every moment. Camera flashes illuminated the scene like lightning, capturing the historic moment when a corrupt judge faced justice in his own domain. The bright natural light streaming through the tall windows seemed to symbolize the transparency finally coming to this dark corner of the justice system. Detective Natalie Sanders, wearing a professional gray blazer and black pants, escorted Captain Gary Ellis through the same doors where he had once entered as a respected law enforcement officer. Now his hands were cuffed behind his back, his corrupt alliance with Judge David Chambers finally exposed to the bright light of justice. His police uniform, once a symbol of protection and service, now marked him as a traitor to everything it represented. "The conspiracy runs deep," Mia Bennett announced to the packed courtroom, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had risked everything for justice. "But today, it ends. Every victim of this systematic bias will have their cases reviewed. Every wrongful conviction will be examined. Every excessive sentence will be reconsidered." Court reporter Janet Thompson, who had secretly documented every prejudiced word, now openly recorded the proceedings with visible satisfaction. Her fingers moved across the stenotype machine with renewed purpose, knowing that every word she captured would help heal the wounds inflicted by years of corruption. Agent Tyler Brooks led Judge David Chambers down from his bench, each step symbolizing his fall from power. The man who had once looked down on defendants with contempt now walked in their shoes, feeling the weight of handcuffs and the sting of public humiliation. The bright courthouse lights that had once illuminated his corrupt reign now exposed his crimes to the world. Outside the courthouse, media vans lined the streets like a small city. News crews from every major network had descended upon the scene, their bright camera lights adding to the midday sun's natural illumination. The story of federal prosecutor Mia Bennett's undercover operation was already spreading across the nation, inspiring hope in communities that had suffered under systematic bias. Mia Bennett emerged from the courthouse steps, the same steps where so many victims had walked away in despair after receiving unjust sentences. Now she stood as their voice, their vindication, their proof that the system could work when good people refused to accept corruption. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Mia Bennett began, her red blazer brilliant against the backdrop of the courthouse's white marble columns. "What you witnessed today was not just the arrest of a corrupt judge. It was the first step in dismantling a network of officials who perverted justice for personal gain." The crowd of reporters pressed forward, their questions mixing with the sounds of sirens as more federal agents arrived to process the arrested conspirators. The bright afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the courthouse steps, creating a stark contrast between light and darkness that seemed to mirror the day's events. "For too long, minorities in this community have faced systematic bias in our courts," Mia Bennett continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Judge David Chambers targeted defendants based on race, seeking to fill private prison quotas in exchange for financial kickbacks. This ends today." Agent Tyler Brooks appeared beside her, his muscular frame and professional demeanor commanding respect from the assembled crowd. The FBI's investigation has uncovered evidence of a conspiracy involving multiple officials, including police officers, prosecutors, and prison administrators. All will face federal charges. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Dennis Cole was being processed in the same holding area where he had once mistreated innocent defendants. His short-sleeved uniform was replaced with standard jail clothing as Detective Natalie Sanders oversaw his booking. The man who had shown unnecessary roughness to minorities now experienced the system from the other side. Prosecutor Thomas Gray sat in a federal holding cell, his expensive suit wrinkled and his arrogance replaced by the reality of his situation. The man who had pushed for maximum sentences regardless of justice now faced the prospect of spending decades in federal prison himself. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity as federal agents collected evidence and interviewed witnesses. The bright fluorescent lighting illuminated boxes of files, financial records, and recorded conversations that would form the backbone of the federal prosecution. Years of corruption were being systematically documented and prepared for trial. Defense attorney Lisa Rodriguez, revealed now as a federal operative, coordinated with other agents to ensure that every victim of Judge David Chambers' bias would be contacted and their cases reviewed. Her role in the operation had been crucial, providing the legal framework for Mia Bennett's undercover work while maintaining the appearance of an overwhelmed public defender. Warden Christopher Webb was arrested at the county jail facility, his corruption extending the conspiracy beyond the courthouse into the prison system itself. His role in ensuring harsh treatment for targeted inmates added another layer to the systematic abuse that had poisoned the entire criminal justice system. How many cases will be reviewed? A reporter called out from the crowd gathered around Mia Bennett. Every case Judge David Chambers presided over in the past 5 years will be examined, Mia Bennett replied, her commitment absolute. We estimate that hundreds of defendants received excessive sentences based on racial bias rather than legal merit. The implications of the investigation continued to unfold as federal agents executed search warrants at the homes and offices of the conspirators. The network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was crumbling under the weight of evidence gathered during months of careful investigation. Agent Tyler Brooks addressed the crowd's questions about the scope of the operation. Federal Prosecutor Bennett volunteered for one of the most dangerous undercover assignments in FBI history. She placed herself at tremendous personal risk to expose this corruption and protect future defendants from systematic bias. The afternoon sun continued to shine brightly on the courthouse, as if nature itself was celebrating the triumph of justice. The same building that had housed so much corruption was being cleansed by the light of truth and accountability. As news of the arrest spread, families of Judge David Chambers' victims began gathering at the courthouse. Tears of relief mixed with anger over years of injustice. But for the first time in years, there was hope. Hope that their loved ones might come home. Hope that the system could change. Hope that justice was more than just a word carved in marble. Mia Bennett looked out at the growing crowd of supporters and victims' families, her heart swelling with pride and determination. The dangerous undercover mission was complete, but the real work of rebuilding trust and ensuring justice was just beginning. The bright lights of the courthouse would continue to shine, but now they illuminated a system committed to equal justice under law rather than systematic oppression. Judge David Chambers' reign of corruption was over, and a new day of accountability had begun. 6 months had transformed everything. The same courthouse that once echoed with corruption now gleamed under bright natural lighting streaming through tall windows, casting hope across marble floors that had witnessed too much injustice. The fluorescent lights overhead worked in harmony with golden sunlight, illuminating a space finally dedicated to true justice rather than systematic oppression. Federal Prosecutor Mia Bennett stood at the prosecution table, her red blazer and black slacks, crisp and professional under the brilliant lighting. But today was different. Today she wasn't undercover. Today she was exactly who she'd always been, a champion of justice, ready to prosecute the man who had perverted everything the legal system was meant to represent. Across the courtroom sat David Chambers, no longer draped in the black robes of authority. He wore a plain gray suit and white dress shirt, looking smaller somehow without the elevated bench and gavel that had once amplified his power. His hands fidgeted constantly, and his face had aged years in just 6 months. The man who had once dispensed harsh sentences with sadistic pleasure now faced the receiving end of federal justice. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the proceedings, her presence commanding respect through fairness rather than fear. A black woman with 20 years of federal experience, she had been specially assigned to ensure absolute impartiality. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the packed courtroom that David Chambers would face judgment from someone representing the very community he had systematically oppressed. Agent Tyler Brooks sat in the front row of the gallery, his muscular frame relaxed for the first time since this investigation began. Wearing a navy blue suit and white shirt, he watched with satisfaction as months of meticulous work finally reached its climax. The evidence boxes stacked beside Mia Bennett's table represented hundreds of hours of investigation, thousands of documents, and the shattered lives that would finally find justice. Detective Natalie Sanders had earned her promotion to lieutenant, and her new badge gleamed under the courthouse lighting. She wore her dress blues with pride, having cleaned house in her own department and helped expose the network of corruption that had infected law enforcement. Captain Gary Ellis was already serving his own federal sentence, and the police department was slowly rebuilding trust with the community. The gallery was packed with faces Mia Bennett recognized from her time undercover. Former inmates who had been released, their sentences overturned, and their records cleared, sat alongside family members who had never stopped believing in their innocence. Some wiped away tears as they watched their oppressor finally face accountability. Mia Bennett rose to deliver her closing argument, the weight of every wrongful conviction, every biased sentence, every corrupted decision resting on her shoulders. The natural light streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight her as she approached the jury box. 12 citizens who held the power to deliver justice. Members of the jury, she began, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. 6 months ago, I stood in this very building and received a 20-year sentence from the defendant. David Chambers looked at me with satisfaction, believing he was crushing another minority life under the weight of his corruption. What he didn't know was that every word, every biased decision, every moment of his prejudice was being recorded and documented for this very moment. The jury hung on her every word. Several jurors glanced toward David Chambers, who kept his eyes fixed on the table, unable to meet the gaze of the woman he had tried to destroy. The evidence presented over these past weeks paints a clear picture of systematic corruption that goes beyond individual bias. This was an organized criminal enterprise designed to fill private prison beds with minority bodies for profit. David Chambers didn't just bend justice, he broke it completely, turning our legal system into a machine of oppression. Mia Bennett moved with confidence, her red blazer a symbol of the courage it had taken to expose this network. Behind her, Agent Tyler Brooks nodded approvingly as she laid out the case that had consumed their lives for months. We've heard testimony from Marcus Williams, sentenced to 15 years for a first-time drug offense that should have warranted probation. We've heard from Sarah Johnson, given 10 years for shoplifting while struggling with addiction instead of receiving treatment. We've heard from dozens of victims whose only crime was appearing before David Chambers, while black or Hispanic. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for Mia Bennett's voice. Even the court reporter, tapping steadily at her machine, seemed moved by the gravity of the moment. But this corruption went deeper than biased sentences. The evidence shows David Chambers received over $2 million in kickbacks from private prison corporations. Every harsh sentence he imposed on a minority defendant generated profit that flowed directly into his offshore accounts, while families were torn apart and lives were destroyed. David Chambers shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His defense attorney, a nervous man in an ill-fitting brown suit, had put up little fight against the mountain of evidence Agent Tyler Brooks and the federal team had assembled. The financial records are undeniable. Bank transfers, cryptocurrency transactions, property purchases, all timed to coincide with periods of increased sentencing disparities. When prison populations dropped, David Chambers received angry calls from his corporate handlers. When populations rose through his biased decisions, bonuses appeared in his accounts. Mia Bennett paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the jury. Several jurors were taking notes, their faces showing disgust at the systematic nature of the corruption. Agent Tyler Brooks will testify that this network included police officers who targeted minorities for arrest, prosecutors who demanded maximum sentences regardless of circumstances, and prison officials who ensured harsh treatment for those unfortunate enough to fall into their web. David Chambers sat at the center of this conspiracy, using his judicial authority as a weapon against the most vulnerable members of our community. In the gallery, former inmates nodded as they relived their experiences. Janet Thompson, the court reporter who had secretly documented years of biased proceedings, continued her work with tears in her eyes, knowing her courage had helped make this moment possible. The defense has argued that David Chambers was simply a tough judge who believed in law and order. But the evidence tells a different story. White defendants with similar charges and criminal histories consistently received probation, treatment programs, or suspended sentences. Minority defendants faced the full weight of David Chambers' corruption. Mia Bennett approached the evidence table, lifting a thick binder filled with sentencing comparisons Agent Tyler Brooks had meticulously compiled. These statistics don't lie. A white defendant charged with armed robbery, probation and community service. A black defendant with the same charge and a cleaner record, 8 years in maximum security. A Hispanic mother stealing formula for her baby, 2 years in prison. A white college student with cocaine, drug court and a clean slate. The patterns were undeniable, and several jury members shook their heads in disgust. The bright courtroom lighting seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the truth itself, finally exposed after years of darkness. David Chambers perverted justice for profit, but the damage goes beyond individual cases. Every biased sentence undermined public trust in our legal system. Every kickback made a mockery of equal justice under law. Every family destroyed by his corruption represents a failure of the oath he swore to uphold. Mia Bennett's voice grew stronger as she moved toward her conclusion, the natural light streaming behind her, creating an almost ethereal effect as justice finally found its voice. But today, in this reformed courtroom, under this fair judge, we have the opportunity to restore that trust. We can show that no one, regardless of their position or power, is above the law. We can demonstrate that corruption will be exposed and prosecuted with the full force of federal authority. Agent Tyler Brooks watched with pride as Mia Bennett delivered the argument that would hopefully end this chapter of corruption forever. Detective Natalie Sanders, now Lieutenant Sanders, knew that cleaning up the police department had been just the beginning of systematic reform. The evidence against David Chambers is overwhelming. Financial records, recorded conversations, testimony from dozens of victims, and statistical analysis all point to the same conclusion. He used his judicial authority to operate a criminal enterprise that targeted minorities for profit. Mia Bennett turned to face David Chambers directly. The man who had tried to destroy her life now forced to listen as she dismantled his legacy of corruption. 6 months ago, David Chambers believed he was sentencing just another minority defendant to disappear into the prison system. What he actually did was trigger a federal investigation that has freed dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals, exposed a network of corruption, and restored justice to this courthouse. The irony was perfect, and several jury members smiled at the poetic justice of David Chambers' downfall, being triggered by his own arrogance and bias. Members of the jury, I ask you to deliver the verdict that David Chambers never allowed his victims to receive. True justice based on evidence, law, and equality. Find him guilty on all counts of corruption, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Show our community that justice delayed is not justice denied, it's justice demanded and finally delivered. Mia Bennett returned to her seat as the courtroom erupted in quiet applause from the gallery. Judge Patricia Williams maintained order with gentle authority, the kind of firm but fair leadership that had been absent from this courthouse for too long. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the bright afternoon light filled the courtroom with golden warmth as the foreman stood to read the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy, to deprive citizens of civil rights, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of accepting bribes in connection with judicial proceedings, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of operating a continuing criminal enterprise, we find the defendant guilty. David Chambers slumped in his chair as guilty verdict after guilty verdict sealed his fate. The man who had once wielded absolute power in this very room now faced the consequences of his corruption. Judge Patricia Williams scheduled sentencing for the following week. But everyone knew David Chambers would face decades in federal prison. The same harsh justice he had dispensed to innocent minorities would now be his reality. As the court session ended and David Chambers was led away in handcuffs, Mia Bennett felt the weight of justice finally being served. Agent Tyler Brooks approached with a smile, knowing their work had fundamentally changed the system for the better. Outside the courthouse, under bright natural sunlight that seemed to represent hope itself, Mia Bennett held a press conference, surrounded by the victims whose lives had been restored through their courage to expose the truth. Today's conviction sends a clear message, she announced to the assembled reporters and community members. Corruption will be exposed, bias will be prosecuted, and justice will prevail, regardless of how long it takes or how powerful the perpetrators believe themselves to be. The courthouse behind her gleamed in the afternoon light, finally serving its true purpose as a beacon of equal justice under law, rather than a symbol of oppression and corruption. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. And in that bright, reformed courthouse, a new day had truly dawned. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.